Okay. Hey guys. My apologies for the delay on getting this one started today. But we are going to jump in here and talk about our week 2 project. And the stuff you're doing over the weekend, probably a little more involved than last week. Last week we were pretty much just going over some of the basics on like making materials, getting texture files connected. Um, this time we're doing a bit more advanced stuff. We're going to be talking about how to use UVs, how to modify the scale of the texture. So if you made like tileable textures from like the 2.1 activity, how do we use those properly to change like how big or large the texture is going to appear in the scene? Um, and then we're also going to do a few other things which are kind of interesting, like assigning different materials to different parts of the object based on UV shell, which is going to allow us to do some variations of different types of paint. But at the end of the day, you guys are kind of like last week, just turning in another render. But this time we're going to have this using the textures you've created in Photoshop. So like the repeating our tileable balcony texture. You've got the little pedestal, in the background that you guys have done with UV shells and masking tricks in Photoshop. And you all have your own texture for the wall as well. So we're going to run through different pieces of this. And of course, like if you guys have questions as we're going through it, feel free to put it in the chat. I can try to run through some other stuff if you guys want me to talk about things even outside the scope of the project, like things you're not sure about or you have questions about regarding how the material works or how the hypershade works. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do the full activity, but I think we're going to be able to hop around with a few different sections here today. Let's kind of focus on the balcony and the paint first, because that's probably like going to be one of the more challenging sections. All right, so what I'm going to do is let's go to perspective on this one. And in my project folder, hopefully what you guys have been doing is in the source images folder, you've been setting up other folders with textures from the different things you've been creating. So like for the balcony texture, I've got like a normal map, I have my tileable texture, I have like the different reference images I use to create that texture. Same thing with the wall. This one's a little more advanced than the other ones, but I do want to go through this just a little bit. And actually, since we're kind of on the topic of this, I think I'm going to show you something kind of interesting here. So, Luke, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, but we've been talking a little bit over the LMS and about some different ways to create different types of textures, like how do you make roughness maps? How do you get your normal maps to work the right way? Like, how do you basically get layered texture effects to work, but also have it work effectively inside of Maya? And so I do want to talk about that for just a little bit and kind of give you a breakdown of what my wall texture looks like and how it's constructed. And I pushed this farther than you guys needed to for 2.1. But basically my wall is made of a few pieces where I have like a stain on the top. This is a separate mask I've created just to like eat away at some of the paint. And then down here I've got my little paint layer using that mask. I have my wall texture behind it. Let me turn all this off so you can see that. Here's my initial wall texture behind everything. I'm really just stacking a bunch of things together. So what kind of happens is when you start making these different types of maps, when you're dealing with a complicated layered texture like this, it can get kind of challenging to get the maps from Photoshop to look right. So for example, like if I look at the normal map generated from this thing, you can tell that looking at it, it almost has the appearance that the white part of the paint, like right here, like where the paint's missing, is recessed inward, right? And the painted sections pop out a little bit. Now, even if this was visually backwards, like if maybe I connect it to the material, and when you render it, maybe it looks like the normal map is the other way, and the part that's sinking in is popping out visually. And there are ways to like invert things to some degree, where you can flip the effect of the normal map, or like dents going in are now popping out, and scratches turn into ridges. Like you can definitely flip this stuff. So the normal map isn't typically the hard part. The hard part is when we start getting into some other types of textures called Roughness Maps. And Roughness Maps, by the way, is something you do not have to worry about this week. I know I think I talked to you guys about this a little bit last week in the live session, but I wanted to kind of run through the thought process on how you make a roughness map if you guys wanted to try it for this week for one of your textures. And if you guys end up doing a roughness map and you let me know about it, like in your feedback when you submit it, I'll definitely make sure to take a look at how you set it up to give you some information on like if you did it properly. And you can also send me the texture you created for the roughness map. So real quick here, let's just do a super quick example of what a roughness map is, because I think the key for you guys is when you start getting into more advanced texturing later on, you're going to start thinking about how colors and numbers are really the same thing. Because according to the software, they are. Numbers turn into a color. When you bring in images that are made up of color, on the back end, those are really converted to numbers, so it figures out how it's supposed to look. So I want to go to this test cam real quick and set up a very simple quick material just to explain this properly, and then we're going to jump into the activity. All right, so what I want to do is I have the bottle selected. We're going to make a Pixar surface. So I have it, clicked on it, right click on that little Pixar surface icon, click that, and let me just call this, roughness test material. If I could spell right, that'd be amazing. Roughness with 3 S's. There we go. So roughness test material. Okay, and that's already on there. So what I'm going to do is kill the color completely. And all I'm going to do is maybe boost these up about halfway for both of them, just so I have like a little bit of a reflection. So it's going to be kind of shiny right now. We'll put this like right in the middle, so it's dead even. 50% intensity for the specular reflection, 50% roughness roughly. Let's see what this looks like real fast. Okay, yeah, that seems like it's working. So I have really just kind of like a brushed metal appearance on this thing. And let me just do a little regional render over that. Okay, so the thing we talked about last time with this is with roughness, let's look at the properties for this, and let me just restart the render again, because that kind of threw off the image. There we go. All right. So before we make the texture, let's do a quick recap on roughness. What is it? It is the surface imperfections for our material. So low roughness is very smooth. High roughness ends up becoming very matte. And visually, high roughness looks really similar to when you have just a gray diffuse color when this stuff's not on. You can see like that gray here looked almost the same as when I had the roughness very high on this thing. Very dry, right? They're both kind of doing the same thing. So the key is sometimes when you're making a material, you want to make a texture that modifies the roughness. And in this case, what we've done is we've made a texture in Photoshop for our color map, and we want to use this to also create a roughness map. And again, this is not a requirement for the activity, but I want you guys to see how to do this anyway. So how do we do something like that? So back in Maya, you have to remember that when you can still put a texture in this attribute. Now this is a number, so I think when you put a texture into a color attribute, it kind of makes sense because you sort of just know that your color texture connects into a color attribute and then it's going to do something. But when you connect a file into an attribute that has a number, what does that mean? Like, do certain colors turn to certain numbers? Does black, is black a number? Is white a number? What does the red, green, blue channels do? Like, how do they all really convert over to this information? So a really good way to understand this is if I do something like, I'm going to use tab and I'm going to type in checker. And I'm going to make a checker texture. And you can see exactly what this looks like. It's very simple. It's just a black and white checker pattern. And I want to make sure that this little guy's turned on. I'm just turning alpha's luminance on to make sure that when I connect this to my roughness attribute, that it uses the color information as the alpha. This all essentially anytime you see this little checkbox, that's all it's referring to, is um, use the color as the alpha. Because sometimes, like if you don't have this turned on, if you have to connect into a roughness attribute, because I want to show you where roughness is. Like this is primary specular roughness, which is right there. So see how when I connect color, it's like saying no. It's like nope, you can't do that because this is 3 channels. This is a single channel attribute. It can only take a single channel output. So what it wants to do is with color, color can only go into another attribute that is 3 channels. So that's 3 channels. I can go into another attribute that is also 3 channels. So this will go into specular edge color because that is 1, 2, 3 RGB. This was also using 1, 2, 3 RGB. So it wants to do 3 to 3, 2 to 2, 1 to 1. That's what it's kind of looking for. So if I do an out alpha to specular roughness, you'll see how this thing just lit up down here. It's like, oh, you just made a connection. It's pulling this guy's alpha channel to create the effect of roughness. But because this checker is a color texture, you can see right there it's a color texture, even though there's not color in it. I mean, I can change it to a color, but it's still 3 channels, and by turning this on, it's going to use RGB and sort of convert that to a single alpha channel. But this is kind of why I want you guys to see this. Oh, let me turn that off, actually. Oops, just lost my dashboard. There we go. Okay, I want you to see what the checker does to the render. All right, so remember that checker is black and white. Now, I'm kind of curious, when you guys look at something like this, and let me actually make this repeat a little bit more so it's easier to see for you guys. I can do that back here. Let's make this a 8 by 8. Okay. So when you see something like this and you're connecting a texture, like this little black and white repeating checker pattern, to the material, do you guys think you know which of these checkers is which one visually here when it's connected to roughness? And well, actually, looking at this, I'm sure you know which one is a high roughness and which one is a low roughness. Like you can tell, like the shiny part is our low roughness, the very dry, kind of rough matte area, that's the high roughness. But do you know which one is the white checker and the black checker? No pressure. Like I'm not expecting you guys to know this, but I'm just curious, like if you think you might know which one is which, or and if you do know, or if you think you know, why do you think you know that one is black or white? Hopefully I'm wording this the right way. So I want you guys to start thinking about like how this information is converting to something on the material. This is where I cue my Jeopardy music. So again, do you know which one of these is the white checker or the black checker? Yeah, it's a 50-50 shot too. So, you know, it's like you're either right or wrong. All right. So let's kind of think through what this means. So if you, the way you want to think about this is remember back on the material, we were talking about how if the attribute roughness is at 0, it's going to be shiny, right? If the attribute of roughness is at 1, it's going to be rough. So really the only thing holding us back from figuring this out is you have to sort of understand visually when you look at something like this, do you know what those colors mean as a number? And here's kind of the simplest way to figure this out. Right, it's all 1s and 0s. If assuming it's just black and white, so if I have, let's click on the color white and just look at this. I'll even look at the RGB channels so you can see that. Here's the RGB values of what we call white. Red is 1, green is 1, blue is 1. So when this information is transferred over, so this is what all the white checkers are being stored as. All the white checkers are 1. So on the UVs, when it looks at the texture, and this is now connected to the material, it sees all the white checkers as having the number 1. That data from the whites gets connected into our roughness, And so what you're seeing is the one, or white, because white and one are the same thing, is now being converted to the rough one right here. So white is telling it to be 1, which according to that attribute is maximum roughness. Black, which is the opposite, is 0, 0, 0. So when you have the black checkers connected to roughness, the roughness looks at the black color. It's like, okay, in those areas, there's a black checker. That means it's 0. 0 means 0 roughness. And so the black checkers are converting over to this one. And the way to kind of to also cheat this, and to, anytime you do something like this, it can get a little confusing because, like, even if you guys didn't know this, I know it probably makes sense now because I'm explaining it, but even if you didn't necessarily know how to begin trying to figure this out, you can always just move sliders around and look what happens. So if I move the black, let's just see which one of those change. See how it's the darker one, the clear? So the black checker is the clear one. The white was the rougher one. Now, and by the way, too, like if you ended up flipping these visually, you can completely flip the result. So we can flip it, we can invert it, we could lower contrast by having these guys a lot closer to each other. It's not always just black and white. Sometimes it's a smaller range where it's compressed values, where it's like, roughly 0.2 or 0.3 and 0.6 or 0.7. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because once you sort of get over that little mental hurdle of just remembering and thinking about that, all right, colors and numbers, you can start to get very clever with how you build these certain types of textures in Photoshop. And this is the thing I was going to try to show you, Luke, separately in a video, but I'm just going to have this as part of the live session because it's kind of important enough where I think this would be good for really anybody watching this just to give it a shot. Now, this is typically something you guys might learn way later down the program, like after the halfway point. And at a different college I used to teach at, this is something I used to teach those students like closer to like the portfolio classes. But we're in month 3, so of course it makes sense to teach it here. We're going to go over this stuff anyway. All right, so what I'm going to do is load up Notepad here, and I'll show you kind of how I break this stuff down in a very simple format. Hopefully I have the ability to change text size in here. I don't think I've ever used Notepad. Oh, good. Fa. Okay. So here's the best way for you guys to think something through. If I'm looking at this texture, we want to identify the different types of textures that make this wall up, and then think about how do we think these textures would react with roughness? Now, obviously, we don't need to get too crazy because my texture has a lot of layers to it. There's like this dirt. I got some type of stain, buried in here. I think what I'm going to do is let's just simplify this down to 3 different types of textures that I've created. I have my initial, we'll just call, I guess, our stone or concrete. It's something kind of similar to that. I have a paint layer. So I have stone, I have paint, and then above that, I've got dirt, right? So I'm just trying to keep this as simple as possible. Stone, paint, dirt. Now, technically, all 3 of those should react differently with light, right? So if you were to connect the color texture to the material and put it in your normal map, that's what normally the assignment is, and that's totally fine if you guys do that. Again, I'm going to emphasize you do not have to do this. I'm just kind of going over it. But if you want to make a roughness texture for this, we really do need to make a very special map, because if I simply just gave this material for the wall some arbitrary number, I'm telling the material that the paint, the stone, and the dirt all have the exact same roughness quality. And we know that's not what it's like in real life. That's not, right now, if you guys look at your keyboard, like on your Alienware laptop, just look at the area to the left of your trackpad where your hand and your wrist, like the palm of your hand kind of rests. I bet you guys can already see, if you move your head back and forth, that there are different roughness variations to that because of the oil being left behind from your skin, right? Just from its resting there. And so just simply even on that material, you're already seeing roughness variation. So it's on everything. So this is one of the most important maps to make in any project. So here's how we would do this for Photoshop. Let's mark down what we've got. I'm going to kind of do this in the order that it's layered in Photoshop. So we've got dirt on top of everything. I've got paint above, we'll just say it's stone. Those are my 3 layers. Okay, now let's take it a little step farther. Let's think about, as a rough guess, what do we think these roughnesses should be? Okay, so dirt to me would be high roughness, right? At least I would think so. Like, just looking at this, like, that's probably some type of high roughness. But if you envision this as more of like water stain damage or something like that, you could say it's a low roughness. So it's kind of up to you to figure that out. But I'm going to say this is dirt. This should be a very gritty, high roughness section. The paint, maybe we'll say that's a mid to low roughness. Because I don't want it to be too low where it's going to start looking like glossy paint. I'm not too sure if I want to go that route. And then the stone, to me, is like the dirt, where it's a high roughness. Okay, now let's expand a little more. Okay, so what is a number that would represent high roughness? Now remember, that slider is 0 to 1, correct? So 1 is like the most extreme rough texture you could ever think of. This, I don't know what would be a good example of that. Maybe like really gritty sandpaper, extremely dry dirt might work. But we could have a pretty high roughness. Maybe we want to say we think it should be not fully rough, but like 0.8 as just like a rough guess. So it's pretty rough, but not maximum. Now we'll do the paint. So this one I think it'd be kind of cool to have some exaggerated differences, right? So if this is pretty rough, I think it'd be kind of cool to see drier dirt on a somewhat lower roughness paint job beneath it. So maybe we say something like that. Or we'll kind of do something a little bit more specific, like 0.35. Okay. Now, the stone below everything, what do we think that should be? And again, I'm just kind of guessing. And I'll let you guys actually tell me, by the way. I'm going to have you kind of figure this one out. So, given that the dirt is around 0.8 for roughness, which is pretty high, paint is kind of our mid to low roughness, what do you think you'd want to do for the stone? And I'll let you totally pick. Do you want the stone to be like similar to the dirt? Is it higher than the dirt on roughness? Do you imagine the stone being between the two? What type of look do you guys want me to do for the stone? I'm going to let you pick. No pressure. You are totally, this is like a choose your fate book. Cool, love it. All right, so we're saying the stone is very specific, 0.65. I like that. So it's going to be not as rough as the dirt. It's definitely rougher than the paint. There's a little bit of a smoothness to it compared to this guy, which I think does make a lot of sense. I like that. So what we've done is we're just establishing a rough idea of what we think these areas should do. Now, you can kind of see how we're like building our way to like answering the question for us, like how do we get from point A to point B? Now is simply how do you do this? How do you make that texture turn to these numbers? Well, remember, numbers and colors are the same thing. And so if you want to visualize what this looks like, just think about what that color is. What is the color for 0.8? Because remember how 0 was black earlier when we were looking at this in Maya, and then white was 1? So if we did this would be a light gray. This is a dark-ish gray. That's the technical term for that. And then light-ish gray. So not as light as this one, but you can kind of see you're just doing variations of gray because it's not really black or white because we didn't pick any of the extremes. So let's do that. Let's start, and it kind of, the way to do this in Maya or in Photoshop really depends a lot on your organization in the PSD document, is if you can pull this off. So what I'm going to do is hide the dirt. Let's hide the paint. Let's just do the bottom layer and figure out how do we convert this to that number. Now, the easy way for me to do this is honestly just to not even use this texture and just literally put a flat painted layer of whatever that color is. So for example, if I did a new layer, and I'm going to name this too, I'm going to call this wall background roughness. So I'm just labeling it so I know what this is. This is my wall background. This is another layer above it where I'm just trying to figure out the roughness for the background. So if we're picking light gray, this is what the light gray color looks like. You can click over here, and you can see right here on this left side, you have this little HSB, hue, saturation, black. So if this is up, it's our brightness is up to 100%. 0, it's completely black. So this means we can actually convert that to the percentage that we're seeing in Photoshop. So if I were to do 80%, that right there as a paint bucket, click. Right now, if I put this texture in Maya, it will do exactly 0.8 roughness. And we're going to try it out in Maya too, by the way. I actually want to see if this works and how it looks. We're going to give this a shot. Now, this is fine, but if you really start to nitpick this thing below it, you can tell that, well, there's technically variation to this, and if we wanted to, we probably could, like, since we know roughly what this should be, we could even take this texture and try to find a way to play with like contrast and different levels controls to turn it to something. Yep. Yeah, so what Luke's talking about is something like this. This is the flat roughness for everything that's stone. Or what I could do is I could set up let's do a group, and I'm going to call this wall background roughness again. Inside the group, I'm going to come down here. We're going to do a hue saturation. We're going to completely yank out all the color first. Now, as a comparison to this, we can all agree that this is visually a little darker than what this one was, right? So it's probably not the average of this isn't really around 0.8. But if I were to go here and add a levels above the hue saturation, what I'm going to do is take the gamma, we're going to slide this over, I'm going to lighten this up and crush the black into it a little bit. There's not really any right or wrong answer for this. I'm just kind of looking at this visually compared to that. And I can also compress blacks, so we could lift this up, compress that down. Let me just turn I'm a little bit darker, so let's also bring this up, slide the lift over a little bit more. A little bit darker still, so let's bring this up. Now, this is probably not too far off, right? I have areas that are a little bit lighter and areas that are a little bit darker than that, but this feels like a good middle ground to what we were talking about with that number. That's a flat value of 0.8. This is like a range of values all kind of hovering on either ends of that 0.8. So that right there could be a good roughness for the wall texture. I know this is a little tricky and it's probably a lot to like absorb here in like a lecture, but does this kind of make sense the way I'm explaining this? Let me know. Now when you get to something like the paint, this is very, very similar to that, right? Now I have to like also think about with the paint, we said is a darkish gray. How would I do that? Now this one's actually a little bit easier for me because my paint, the way I set it up, is literally just a flat kind of teal, a dark teal with a mask on it. Like if I hold shift and click on the mask, this is just disabling it. You can see what it is. There's not really a whole lot to it. So I'm going to really quickly label this paint layer color because I'm going to duplicate this so I still have my original. Let's drag this. So what I'm going to do is duplicate the layer, by the way. I'm dragging my paint layer color down to the new layer button to duplicate it. And I'm going to really quickly rename this to paint layer roughness. Let's just turn off the color for a second. Okay. Now, getting the value of this in there is very easy. Now, one thing I have to be careful about is look at my blend mode. I had this set to a multiply. Now remember, multiplication, I have a low opacity. This is going to, I did this because I was trying to get the color and the gray behind it to sort of just mix and blend into something a little bit different. When I'm doing roughness, I don't really want to get it into blend modes because that's going to make it exponentially more difficult to get this number to ever match because you're now worrying about how that number blends into the number behind it. It's a mess. We're not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is put this blend mode back to normal. So it's no longer multiplying. And I'm going to put the opacity all the way up to 100%. So this is like, it's completely opaque and visible, well, except for the mask information, and it's just a solid flat color. So it's much, much easier to wrap our head around it. Now what we're going to do is very simply get that number right there, 0.35. So I'm going to click black value, or the brightness value of 35%. There's our dark gray like we talked about. G, I'm in the color, I'm just going to simply click. And just like that, we have our darker area, which is a lower roughness, layering on top of the other roughness. And I have all the color layers hidden. So you see how we're stacking our roughness values together. And now we're really just down to this guy. Oh, sorry, the dirt on the top. I did do that right, didn't I? Did I? Wait a minute. I think I did that right. Yes, that's right. I'm starting to second guess if I got the dirt and the stone mixed up, but I think I did that. All right. On the dirt, so let's see how I did this one. This would be multiply. Okay, this one is going to be tricky. Now, sometimes when you do this, there's not really going to be any easy way to get it to work because this is another one of those layers where there's like a levels on it. So I'm like clipping something out to like prevent this little masking line issue. It's set to a multiply blend mode. And this layer is a texture as well. So this one's much more complicated to do. But I think as long as we have like a rough idea of what it should look like, it's still going to work. So let's try this out. I'm going to re-enable this to wall stain color. Okay, I'm going to duplicate the layer and put this above. I need to link this to it because when I duplicated it, it kind of broke. Excuse me. It broke this little connection. Let's just turn all that off for a second. I just want to get this separate. That way I can kind of redo this without screwing up the other one over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just like we did at the way bottom, I'm going to desaturate it and then play around with the levels until we get this to look right. So let's call this wall stain roughness. Go here. We're going to do a saturation. I'm going to hold Alt and click. We're just going to pull out all the color. You can see there's a little bit of a brown tone near the top. So add some dirt in that texture. And then we're going to do another one, levels, Alt click, just to link the levels to it. So all these guys are now linked to that texture, just like you guys were seeing in some of my videos. All right, so those are both multiply. Okay, this one's going to be a little trickier because in order for this to work, the dirt has to be a lighter color. Now, because this is set to a multiply, this is only going to make it darker than what's below it. I need to make this lighter. So what we're going to do instead is let me try going to something that will make it brighter, like let's do an add. I know this looks screwed up, but bear with me. We are going to drop in. So now see when I do an add, how it's making the lighter part way brighter than the dirt. And I want this to be the light part. Because remember, the lighter part of the dirt is 0.8. I don't want it to make the areas around the dirt that much lighter, which is like practically white. That's like saying this area of the paint, it should be maximum roughness. So this is what I'm talking about, where occasionally you have to get in some little voodoo here to like trick this into looking right. So I'm going to throw an invert on there to basically flip the colors first, desaturate it. Now we're going to go to levels, and now, because I'm doing add, I think I can clip out the bottom part with black point. And now all I got to do is figure out how much lighter I want this dirt to appear visually to make it look rougher. So if you compare that to this, that's that lighter roughness from the dirt layering over the lower roughness for the paint, which layers over the higher roughness for the stone. That is your roughness map. See, isn't that easy? It's probably like the most complicated thing you've seen since you started the college. Um, but like, I know this is it's probably a lot to kind of take in, but I think it's important for you guys to sort of like understand like at least my thought process when I go through something like this. I try to be very like conscious about like how numbers and colors work together. I try to visualize numbers and colors as much as possible, and it's going to become a lot easier for you. And once that thing kind of clicks, and it's going to become such like an easy second nature thing for you that regardless if you're doing texturing in Maya, Painter, Photoshop, doing color correction in Nuke, all this stuff is going to become so easy for you to do because you don't have to think about it and mess with sliders. You just know what the answer is already. It's just a matter of you wiggling things around until it looks right. I know, right? Once you know the workflow, like you will probably be doing roughness maps on everything. Um, I'm gonna save this out though. So I thought this would be kind of cool just to show you guys. And then if you want to give it a shot, you're more than welcome to do that. So I'm just going to save this one out as let's do a PNG, and I'm going to call this wall texture. Let's do a wall roughness texture. All right. It is cool though. Like I love roughness maps. They look so good. Like once you figure out how to do these guys, like it's the best map in Maya. It's just usually not something we teach students like early on in the program because it is very you can tell it's not the easiest thing to understand. Color is the big one everyone gets. Like we all know what color maps are supposed to look like, and even normal maps like kind of make sense. Like it's just little bumps and stuff. Roughness does take a bit to kind of master properly. All right, so let's just let me throw the default material back on there one more time because yeah, I got to put that back on. I just want to get rid of that one that we were messing with earlier. Okay, let's go back here. We did it, guys. I'm going to save this too because this might be a fun thing to go over with a different group later. Um, all right, well, let's get out of Photoshop. We're done with that. We're good. Now, even though like that probably was kind of cool to see it all, just as a heads up, once you guys get into Painter, you know this back and forth we're doing right now, where it's like I'm like trying to think about colors and numbers, and then sort of like guess what it should look like before I get to Maya, and then I have to connect it and visualize it in Maya. When you get to like another type of painting software where you're seeing the textures and materials literally on the 3D model in real time, it takes out all this extra work that we're doing of going back and forth. Painter, when you make your roughness map, you see it on the model immediately. If it's not rough enough or too rough, you just simply move a slider in Painter and just watch it update until it looks good. Yeah, yep, and I know exactly what you mean, Luke, because you start getting these textures that have a lot of variation to it, and you know it's supposed to look a certain way when the light hits it. And if you don't have the roughness map, it makes all the work you put into the color texture look like a complete waste of time. And I think it's what you're talking about. Because it makes it look like the texture's not even doing anything. It's just like a color map that doesn't react with light at all, and it looks completely flat. Yep, that's the roughness map. We need those guys. All right, so let's run through a couple things real quick. I got about 20, 25 minutes still I can kind of still do this for, so we might go a little bit over, but that's okay. I do want to go over a couple things here with you guys. So we're going to blitz through some of this stuff so I can get to the wall because I do want to see how that roughness map looks. Actually, let's do the wall first. Why not? Let's jump in there and do that. All right, so I got the wall selected. We're going to make a new material, so I'm going to have it selected. We're going to also have the background here because these two should be using the same material. So we'll have both those guys. Well, I'll just do it on the building first. Sorry. Pixar surface. This is turning into a mess. Let me close out of half these little windows in Hypershade. This is ridiculous. Let's clear the graph. Okay. I made a new material called Pixar Surface 3. I'm going to hold down Control and double click on it to do my little rename shortcut. And I'm going to call this wall material. Okay. Now I want to graph it. So how do we graph our material? We hold our right mouse button down over it and choose Graph Network. Okay, there's wall material, there's our shading group. Let's really quickly knock out some of these little texture connections, and I'll do the roughness map last. Actually, let's do the roughness map first so you can see it, because if I start connecting color and normal maps, it's going to kind of hide some of the work that we did. So it's on there. What I'm going to do is render it, and I just want to get the color turned to black for just a moment, and I'm going to get the specular value set up. So let's give it a little bit of a value for face color. So you can see a little bit of a shine where it's reflecting the sky above it. We're going to give it some Fresnel reflections. We're going to boost this guy up. We should see a little bit more on the edges. Okay, this is kind of around where I was showing you guys to put it last time for some of the other videos. But this is kind of, it's in the documentation. You'll see me use the same setup right here all the time. This is kind of my go-to. And right now, like, it's fairly shiny, right? That looks like a glossy material. As I go up, you can see it starts to dry out and get a little bit more matte. And of course, very high, it's very matte and very dry. So this is where the texture is going to go eventually. It's this guy right here. Now, we're going to come over here, and I'm going to hit Tab, File. We're going to make a file, Texture. And actually, before I do this, sorry, real quick, I am going to save this immediately as part 2, just in case anything goes wrong, we can recover it. Okay. I'm going to hit the folder button, and we're going to go to our wall textures. It should be right there. There she is. We're going to hit open. Oh, there's one thing I haven't talked to you guys about yet. This is super important for this. Okay. There's a part of this that's very important that I'm not going to have time to get into with you guys. There's a thing called color space. Do you guys know what this is, real quick? Do you guys know what color space means? What any of this stuff is talking about? I'm assuming you probably don't, or most of you in here probably don't know what this means. But in another class, I'm going to be talking to you guys about this way later down the pipeline at the school. But color space basically determines how textures and colors are interpreted when they're saved and opened from different softwares. And you guys have actually been doing kind of a simplified version of this before. Remember, like, when you guys have been saving your textures, I've been telling you guys to turn on that burn-in mapping on save in their image tool. And like, you had to turn that on to make sure that the render was saved with the right intensity. That's actually the same thing as this. So you're saving it with a certain color space to make sure it looks right when you view the texture outside of Maya. But basically, what I'm going to get around to here is that color textures, like your RGB color file, uses sRGB color space. So you've never had to worry about this. But because we're creating and loading in a texture that is not a color attribute, we're about to load in what's called a scalar texture, which is a 0-to-1 black to white image. Those are supposed to be set to a different color space in order for Maya and RenderMan to interpret the information properly. So if you guys decide to use a roughness map for this project, in order for those values to react exactly like you anticipated in Maya, you have to change this from sRGB to raw. It's super important. You'll learn more about this later, but for right now, just remember, if it's a color file with RGB color, it's sRGB. If it's going to be a black and white map connecting to an attribute that has just a number, those are the files that you set to raw. As long as you remember that, you're good. But this is something very important you want to do. Okay, now since I'm also about to do a connection to roughness, which is a number, I'm going to do out alpha to specular roughness. And you can see that is now connected. Oh, sorry, my stream just kind of freaked out there for a second. And because I'm doing out alpha, I'm also going to come down to color balance and turn on alpha is luminance. So it's 3 steps. Color space raw, alpha is luminance turned on, and it's going to be the alpha channel from the file going into specular roughness. And we should, if I render it, we should see it. And it might take a second to update because it has to convert that texture to the RenderMan texture, the .text. So you have to give it one moment here. Oh. It did it. Yep. Now, it's not scaled properly. It's way too big, but if you look closely at some of the sections, see how there's like areas which it looks a little bit different? I think it is working. I think what's happening is we're getting a lot of the paint, so it's very glossy. We're not getting much of the other stuff. So what I'm going to do is fix the UVs because I need to scale this texture way down. So I'm going to go into the UV editor, and this is actually something, even though I'm doing it with a roughness map, what I'm doing right here, this is something you need to do anyway, even with your color map, because when you load in your color map, you have to remember that if you look at the wall in the UV editor, which is right here, by the way, it's the same area you guys were in when you did the pedestals UVs for the 2.1. This 0 to 1 grid right here, imagine your full texture for the wall fitting in here. And then think about visually, what part of the wall are you seeing? Because this is the entire outside part of the wall. That right there is the inside of the building. This is the wall on the inside. The only part you're seeing in the render right there, you actually can kind of make it out. That's the door. That's the window. So this little chunk right there, see where I'm highlighting what it's selecting right there? That little pocket in the entire texture, we're only in the render seeing the far right side halfway up the texture file. Everything else we did in the map is off the screen somewhere on a different part of the wall that we're never going to notice. So because of that, I need to blow these UVs way up to make sure that the entire texture fits in this one section. This is why we're trying to make these things tileable typically. I don't actually know if the one I'm using right now is tileable. It probably isn't, but it's fine. So I'm just going to hold down right mouse button. We're going to go to UV shell. I'm just marquee selecting over everything, and we are going to scale this guy way up. I'm going to try to move it so those windows and doors are kind of in the middle. You don't have to do this, but I just want to remember that's where I'm trying to see this texture. I can see dirt. Yeah, if you turn off the resolution gate, you actually can make out some of the dirt sections on it. It's working. I think it's just a little tricky. I think the paint we did is way too glossy. So I probably messed up on our roughness for the paint. And I wish I could actually move this without it showing selection highlighting. That's very annoying. Because I need to move it around, but eventually you will see the dirt. Oh, there it is. There's some of it. Yeah, it's kind of appearing here. The problem with, I think, mine right now is our value that we made for the paint, that 0.35, that's really shiny. Now, it might look better when I have the normal map on there and add some bumpiness, but you can still see it is working. I can see dirt stains and patterns. I don't know. That's some of the dirt splatter near the top. I have the texture seam is starting to show up pretty bad in mine, so I need to play around with the scale a little bit because it is definitely not tileable right now for me. But I think you guys kind of get the idea. Let me just bring this down a little bit. Let's do that. And yeah, that's probably going to be good enough for now. I don't want to mess around with this thing too much so we can still do other fun stuff. All right, we're going to go with that. I'll let you guys play around with that a little bit. But I'd probably want to go back in Photoshop and then play around with that paint value and raise that up. But you can see some areas where it is rougher right there. So it definitely did work. That's where we go back to Photoshop and experiment. All right, let's do the color file real quick. We'll do this a little bit faster now. So tab, file, texture. Here's our color map. This is the part you're actually doing that's required. So color to color. Oh, come on. Out color to diffuse color. There we go. We're going to load in our color map. Wall texture. Lovely. And there it is. Beautiful. So you have our color texture now on there. So now the roughness and color are working together. You can kind of get a better idea where it lines up to. It's a bit light, so I'm going to drop down my diffuse gain quite a bit on this one. I want to darken that down a little more. Okay. And now that I can see the texture a bit easier, I think I can actually get these UVs adjusted a little bit easier. I want to go up. Let's do that. There we go. Yeah, I kind of like that white dirt stain right there in the middle. There we go. Nice. And let's make it just a wee bit smaller. Cool, that'll work for now. All right, so I got that connected. I got some variation. Let's do the normal map real quick. So normal map, tab, we're going to do Pixar normal map. There it is. Took a second for it to pop up. So this is not going to use a file node. This is a completely different node to load into the normal map texture. You can still, I mean, technically you could load normal map on a file node, but it's when you connect it, it'll actually break. It won't know how to interpret the data properly. So we're going to use a node that comes with a render band that's specifically for normal maps called Pixar normal map. We're just going to click, hit the folder. This is balcony texture. Oh, but the wrong folder, that's why. Wall is my normal map. We're going to hit open. It's loading it, and to connect this one, we want to connect it to, I'll show you the attribute. Under globals, there's a bump attribute. This bump is also for normals. And you can see if you put your mouse over it, this little tooltip pops up. Connect to Pixar bump node here if you need a bump, normal map nodes. This is the same thing. So we're going to connect it through the little node editor as well. We're going to click on the white dot, result N, which is result normal. So these are the XYZ or colors of the normal map. Result normal, going to bump normal. It just connected. And we should, oh, it's working. Yep. Now, this is where you kind of like look at it and figure out, okay, visually, what is it doing? Is it backwards? And what I'm noticing is that it feels like, one, it's very, very intense, but it's also doing the exact opposite, I think, of what we expected, right? This is popping out. The paint should be the part that pops out on top of the stone, not the other way around. This almost looks like a weird foam on top of the surface. So we can invert it. That's going to be the easiest way to do it. We're going to flip it visually. And now you can see this looks like the stone area is recessed off from the other layer of paint. Now the next issue is that overall it is just way too intense. This is a very, very strong normal map. So at the top of this guy, there's this thing called bump scale. This is what you're going to have to reduce to tone this effect back. So if I go from 1 to 0.5, see how it's like starting to ease back on how drastic and intense the bumps are. Let's do maybe 0.35 possibly. And maybe we could do something like that. Because I want it to be there, I just don't want it to be, I don't want it to be that crazy. Like this is the only part we're going to see in the render anyway. All the other stuff on the outside is not visible, but just easing that back until it looks about okay. It's typically 0 to 1. If you go to 0, it's just like having this thing off. It's not going to do anything. It's completely flat. But 0.35 is a pretty good visual balance where I think it reads okay. And this, by the way, this number doesn't mean that's what you use on yours. This is something you have to kind of figure out when you look at your normal map on the surface. It's all based on the type of stone you picked, the scale of the UVs. There's a lot of factors that go into it, the lighting. You just kind of have to eyeball it until you think it feels about right. So there's not really much of a trick to that. Okay, but now it's connected. So that's it. We just did the entire wall. We even did a little bit more than we needed to because we have the roughness map in there. We have color, roughness, normal map, all connected. and we end up with something that looks like that. Not too bad though. There's a little bit of variation. If you're getting black spots from the map, uh, one, I would make sure your normal map doesn't have artifacts in it. Like it should still be. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now, it could be that there's something visually wrong with the normal map itself, like the way it was created in Photoshop may have caused an issue. Um, it could also be how it was connected, possibly. But yeah, if you could send me a render of what it looks like, I think that'd be kind of helpful. I know what you're talking about because I've seen black spots in some of mine before as well, but I think I'd have to see what it looks like in yours to give you a better idea what's going on. But typically that happens when the normal in that location is reversed or broken, and it's treating it like the normal's been flipped the opposite direction. It happens a lot when you have really high contrast images that you turn to a normal map, and it does a really crap job trying to figure out what the normal map value should look like. But we should be able to figure it out. Sometimes what I've done, by the way, is occasionally if I run into issues, this is such a hack job way to do it. If you know visually when you look at the normal map where you're seeing some type of artifact, you could, like if it's like only in a couple small spots, like a couple like of these random little bumps, you could totally open up the normal map in Photoshop, take the heal brush and clone stamp and patch over some of the bumps where it's just giving you the artifact. So it's kind of a nice alternative to 99% of the map is working, but those few sections, if you know where they are on the map and you can identify it, you could just simply clone them out and just try doing a test render with like that cloned version where you've painted sections out just to see if that gets around the issue without too much work. I've done it a couple of times with some normal maps and other projects. So there's always a backup plan for something like that. Let's do the balcony real quick because I do want to show you the painted thing. So I'm going to blow through this extremely fast. Let's clear the graph. I'm going to set up some tabs real quick down here to show you how we organize this. So this is the untitled. This is like our test area. I'm going to make a new tab. We're going to call this wall. And on the wall tab, I'm going to graph the wall material. I'm going to make a new tab. We're going to call this balcony. Now for this, so I can now see multiple materials while I'm working on the scene instead of always regraphing something. Wall, balcony. We're going to select all the balcony pieces. Now thankfully these are in a group, so if you hit up when clicking on a piece, it should automatically navigate to the balcony group, but just either way, find the balcony group, right click on the material, do Pixar surface. That'll assign it. Now we've got control, double click. Balcony material. Okay, and let's just blow through this one super fast. We're going to do kind of the same thing there. Tab, file texture. Whoops. So we don't have a roughness map for this one, so this should be a little bit easier for us. All right, balcony. This is much more similar to what most of you guys are going to be doing. So we have our color map. And I said if you don't want to connect with the little noodles and inputs and outputs, by the way, you can just middle mouse drag from the top of the file node onto the attribute word in the attribute editor. That does the exact same thing. Okay, so that one's good. We'll do that the same way for the normal map. So I have tab, Pixar normal map. Let's go and load in the texture. So this is on the wall now. We're going to back up to the balcony. Balcony normal. This one's very bumpy, so we could potentially get those artifacts in this one. Let's do the middle mouse thing just like we did before. So again, if I hate the little noodles and input and output connections down here, no worries. Find the attribute you want to connect to, and all you got to do is simply middle mouse drag that node onto the word of the attribute like this. It does the exact same connection. So it's totally up to you on which one you want to use. And we should be seeing it. All I got to do is get the... Oh, wow, that's bright. Yeah. We're going to tone that back. So this is kind of like where when you're doing this, just because you made the texture, you don't really know how it's going to look until you see it in the scene. And there are going to be some subtle things you have to modify to get the whole piece to feel cohesive. My issue right now is that this just looks a little too bright for me compared to some of the other elements. So maybe what I would do on this material is just pull that diffuse gain down, kind of like I did with the wall, until that feels a little darker. Like I like this more than what it was at before. There we go. So I like that. Yeah, and if you like doing the middle mouse thing, you can totally do that for everything. There's not really any preference for me. I like them both. Um, the normal map, okay, it's working. I want you to see this right here as an update. It's working, but it's working too well. Look at like how bumpy that is right there. Now, some of this too is probably because my roughness is very low, and so those it's very shiny, and that's kind of creating some almost glossy effects, which are exaggerating the bumps. So let me just make the stone a bit rougher. So I don't have a map for this one. I'm just kind of using a slider. But even as a higher roughness, that really still feels pretty bumpy, right? So kind of similar to the wall. We're gonna go to that Pixar normal map. I gotta fade this thing back quite a bit, like maybe zero point 0.5, maybe even less than that. And when you do the normal maps, don't be surprised if you don't really know what to do with it until you do some of the final renders. So I should probably be using the image tool to do a couple high quality test renders. Maybe while I go get food or relax, watch a movie, come back and just kind of see what it looks like. Because when the render's finished and it cleans up a lot of the grain, you'll have a way better idea if these are off. So I'll do that a lot where I work on something late at night. I let it render overnight, and then the next morning I kind of look at the image, take some notes down, and then I know the next day if I start modifying it before I do my next render, I'll make a couple quick adjustments, so hopefully it'll work and be exactly where I need it. But I always like doing those test runs first before I commit to a final, because the normal maps are hard to see until it's much cleaner. That seems okay. So maybe 0.3, 0.2, somewhere around there is not too bad for this one. All right, I know we're a little bit over. The last thing I want to show you real quick is this is typically the hardest part of the activity. I really wanted to make sure we still covered this. It's this right here. So one of the challenging parts about this project is not making the materials and connecting the attributes. I think you guys know the material part we did today was actually pretty easy, right? Making the Pixar surface, connecting a color texture in the normal map. None of that's really too difficult. This is the hard part. Well, it's kind of easy, but it could be kind of hard for some of you guys because you haven't done UV assignments before. We basically are going to make a material that is very similar to the same balcony material. We're going to change the color, and I want to make sure that I'm assigning this new colored or tinted material to very specific parts of the geometry. Now, what's kind of unique about this is typically when you guys have been assigning materials, you've always been assigning it to an object or objects, or a group, like groups of objects, but it's always been something object related. What makes this unique is I'm now telling you guys to not assign it to an object, because an object is this full post. I'm trying to get you guys to assign it to a UV shell, and this is a little different. So there's a bunch of tricks we can do to make this very quick, and we're going to make this pretty efficient. Remember that we've already made the balcony material. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So if we like the way the balcony material looks, we're going to use that as our starting point so we can cut out a massive amount of time. So let's just turn the render off for a second. I'm going to save my scene because we're on a roll here. I'm going to come in here. We're going to make a new tab. I'm going to call this balcony paint. Okay, so here's how we do this. I'm going to click on the balcony material. You can also click on it up here, but we're going to select it. I'm going to go to the balcony paint tab of the Hypershade, where I'm going to have a new graphed material, and we're going to go up to edit. Actually, let me show you this first because I want you guys to understand what this is before I just click this button. So what I'm going to do here in a minute is I'm going to duplicate this network, but I want you guys to really understand the difference between these because these are All very, very different duplication methods. Now, you know how you guys probably remember from some of my earlier activities, even you guys have probably done this too. There's the regular duplicate Maya, like Control D. Like you can click on an object, duplicate, move it around. There's like another, copy of the object you just had. You can duplicate lights. It's a really common thing we do in the software. The reason this is a little trickier here is you have to remember when you're choosing to duplicate in the hypershade, remember you're not selecting one thing here. There's a bunch of things that make up a material network. And so depending on how you choose to duplicate it, you're going to get completely different results on what Maya does. Does it duplicate just the material? Does it duplicate the material with the input connections? Does it duplicate the material separately and use the previous input connections? So is like the whole thing copied, just a piece of it copied? Is it copied, but it's still referencing stuff from the other network where these files are going into two different materials? So there's a lot of different ways this can kind of happen. If you click on the material and do duplicate without connections to network, which is this, look what happens. This simply duplicates the material, but look what's missing. See how there's a connection there? No connection. No connection. So it has all the settings and sliders are fine, but it didn't take any of this stuff. So that way kind of sucks, right? Let's not do that. If I have it selected and I do duplicate with connections to network, this one's really powerful. I like using this one quite a bit. This is kind of interesting. What this does is it makes a copy of it. So it is a different material, so technically I could modify this, but notice how it sources its information from the same nodes. Now the reason why this one's pretty powerful, even though you guys probably don't want to do this for this particular activity, is because now if I had another material where I changed some settings, if I update the texture file, it will feed into both materials with one node, as opposed to you loading in the texture file multiple times across 5 or 6 materials that all use the same information. So this is almost kind of like Nuke, where one thing splits off into many things. Okay, let's delete that. The one you guys are going to use is the other option, which we haven't done yet. This is duplicate shading network. So I'm going to click on it. I'm going to go to a new tab, so hopefully it creates in here and doesn't get thrown into this mess. But you have it selected, and we're going to pick the other one. This duplicates the whole thing. It's kind of threw it out of order visually. It's supposed to be like that, but it's the same thing. That and that. The only thing we're missing is this, but this should hopefully create itself once we assign this to the object. That thing we're missing is called the shading group. So we're going to call this balcony paint material. And again, all I did is I clicked on the material, not the other nodes, just the material, and we did edit, duplicate, shading network. That literally made a copy of the entire thing. So that saves us a lot of setup. Now let's assign it, okay? So we're going to go to perspective, and I'm going to show you how to assign this thing. And it should be on all the posts, but really the only ones you can see in the render are just a couple here. It doesn't really matter to me if you do them all, as long as the ones visually in the render look okay. But I'll run through it real quick with you. Let's just do these guys. I'm going to hold shift, click on them, go in the UV editor. So I want you to see what these look like. In the documentation, I'm pointing at which ones you have to select to make it a little bit easier for you. It's that big piece, a thin piece below is like a little bit of a gap, and then the circular piece at the bottom. Those are the pieces that line up with what you're seeing in this image. That, and there's that circular piece on the bottom. Okay, so let's do that real quick. I'm going to hold my right mouse button down, go to UV shell. I'm just going to simply make a very thin marquee selection through there. Marquee line through that. I'm holding shift, going through that. Marquee shift right there. Those are the pieces I want. Now I still have them selected. You can see they're lighting up right here. Back in the hypershade, I'm going to now hold my right mouse button over the material here or here. This material and that are the same thing. So it doesn't matter which one you pick. Hold right mouse button down, pick assign material to viewport selection. See how it made this thing automatically? Okay, object, unclick. Now you notice it turned black. Technically this is happening because there's a small glitch with the shading group it's missing a connection in here, but it doesn't really matter. It's actually kind of a happy accident because this will show you very easily that it worked, because you can kind of see that it's hitting the right areas that you expected. But when you render it, it's not going to be black. It'll look correct. Okay, let's do it again a little bit quicker right here. Boom, boom, boom. Oops, go in here. Oh, see how it didn't show up? It's annoying. You actually have to have the UV editor open first for some reason. They changed that recently. It's really stupid. Right click, UV shell, hold shift. We're just going to marquee through that stuff real quick. Okay, over here, right mouse button, assign. Okay, let's do this as well. It's 5 on this one, but it's the same idea. We're just zipping through it. Okay, assign. I'm just doing the same thing over and over. Let's just really quickly do the other side because we're almost done anyway. Why not? Can't see them, but maybe it'll look good in a reflection somewhere. So I'm just doing the same thing over and over. Okay, get it selected, right click, come on, assign, boom, there we go. You can see where those are all hitting, and I'll show you why we're doing this. So if I render it, it's probably not going to look any different yet, but I want you to see what's going to happen when I modify something in a second. Yeah, because since we duplicated the material, it's a duplicate. It's not going to look different. But because it is technically a separate material, watch what I can do in here. Now, because I have a fairly light texture on the file node where the texture is being loaded in, I can change the color gain or color offset. Now, color gain is to make it darker and apply a color to it. So this is like multiplication in Photoshop, where it tints it and makes it darker. Think of this kind of like a stain. Like, you know, if you have like a white t-shirt, you get ink on it or wine, it makes it darker and stains it. That's what color gain is. It's a stain and darkening effect. It's a tint. Offset adds a color. So the one you're going to pick depends on what type of texture you have on here. If you have a very light texture like I do, use color gain because you need to make it darker. If you have a very dark texture here and you're trying to make that a painted color, you need to make the paint lighter than the dark color here. So it's all dependent on your texture. Use this for a lighter texture, use this for a darker texture. They both work the same way aside from that. So I'm going to click. I'll pick one kind of similar to what I did before. We're going to do HSV. I'll do kind of like a, let's do like maybe like a brownish color maybe. Yeah, see how it showed up right there? And let's just darken it down a little bit. There you go. So I've kind of got a brown color, and that is now multiplied, because this is multiplication, against the file. So that is now multiplying a color on the file before it hits the material. It has now tinted it because that material is only assigned to those pieces. So it's kind of cool that this is a situation where, because we're assigning something to UV shells a certain way, we're now able to tint part of the material in very specific locations to help break up the texture. So you guys are going to be doing that as well. That's probably the hardest part of the whole activity, is that one section right there. And I do cover that in the videos, but I wanted you guys to kind of see that here so you understand what we're doing. But do the balcony first. Get this in the wall maybe out of the way. You can even skip the paint and come back to it after you get the wall knocked out and like the pedestal. Do maybe the paint last, but duplicate your balcony material as a starting point, then assign it, change the color, and just verify it's hitting all the right spots in the render. And if you ever mess it up, like if you assign that material to the wrong part of the post, remember that you can always reset it by clicking on a post that was screwed up and then assign the other balcony material back to it, and then just redo the UV selection again for that one piece. So even if you mess it up on one, it's still easy to redo it. You just have to put the original balcony material back on the busted object, and then just start that one piece over again with the selection. Whew. All right. We did it. I think that was it. This was a marathon of a lecture for me. We covered a lot of information. It's kind of cool, though, getting into the roughness map stuff, because that's been something I've wanted to talk about quite a bit. Way outside of the scope of what we're doing for the activity, because it's much more complicated, but it's really cool. Really cool stuff. Do you guys have any questions about any of that? Awesome. Yeah, hopefully this is helpful. I love this. This part of the whole pipeline is one of the best spots, by the way. I think I say that every month. I told you guys this in Shading and Lighting 1. Like, Shading and Lighting 1 and Lighting and Rendering is the best one. Now I'm telling you, this is the best one. Being a nuke is the best one. But they're all really fun because this is where you deal with, like, color, um, materials, lighting, the beautiful imagery we see in the movies and games. This is, I think, where it all becomes, like, alive and realistic. So have fun with the activity this weekend, guys. Real excited to see what you all do at the end of week 2. And you're going to keep finessing this project over the months. So even if something doesn't work out in week 2, you still have 2 more weeks to address critiques and issues, and then keep refining it until we get to the end of week 4. Awesome. Yeah, do what you can. I'm just excited to see what you guys end up creating this month. So it's kind of a cool project because you have a lot of artistic and creative freedom to play around with different types of textures and colors. All right, well, thanks guys for hanging out with me. I will probably talk to you either tomorrow or maybe at the next live session. Everybody have a good night.